cup of coffee and thinking about his own problems. But a delicately balanced rock 100 yards below his campsite toppled over and slid downhill. It started a miniature avalanche of stones and rocks. The loose stuff did not travel far, but the original balanced rock bounced and rolled for some distance before it came to rest. Echoes rolled between the hillsides, but they were not very loud, and they soon ended. Lockley guessed automatically at half a dozen possible causes for the small rock slide, but he did not think at all of an unperceived temblor from a shock like high explosives going off 30 miles away. 8 minutes later he heard a deep-toned roaring noise to the northeast. It was unbelievably low-pitched. It rolled and reverberated beyond the horizon. The detonation of 100 tons of high explosives, or an equivalent impact, can be heard for 30 miles, but at that distance it doesn't sound much like an explosion. He finished his breakfast without enjoyment. By that time, well over 3/4 of the Air Force on the Pacific coast was airborne, and more planes shot skyward instant after instant. Inevitably, the multiplied air traffic was noted by civilians. Reporters began to telephone air bases to ask whether a practice alert was on, or something more serious. Such questions were natural these days. All the world had the jitters. To the ordinary observer, the prospects looked bad for everything but disaster. There was a crisis in the United Nations, which had been reorganized once and might need to be shuffled again. There was a dispute between the United States and Russia over satellites recently placed in orbit. They were suspected of carrying fusion bombs ready to dive at selected targets on signal. The Russians accused the Americans, and the Americans accused the Russians, and both may have been right. The world had been so edgy for so long that there were fallout shelters from Chillicothe, Ohio, to Singapore, Malaya, and back again. There were permanent trouble spots at various places where practically anything was likely to happen at any instant. The people of every nation were jumpy, and pressure on governments and on political parties so that all governments looked shaky and all parties helpless. Nobody could look forward to a peaceful old age, and most hardly hoped to reach middle age. The arrival of an object from outer space was nicely calculated to blow the emotional fuses of whole populations. But Lockley ate his breakfast without premonitions. Breezes blew, and from every airbase along the coast, fighting planes shot into the air and into formations designed to intercept anything that flew on wings, or to launch atom-headed rockets at anything their radars could detect that didn't. At 8:20, Lockley went into the electronic baseline instrument which he was to use this morning. It was a modification of the devices used to clock artificial satellites in their orbits and measure their distance within inches from hundreds of miles away. The purpose was to make a really accurate map of the park. There were other instruments in other line-of-sight positions very far away. Lockley's schedule called for them to measure their distances from each other sometime this morning. 2 were carefully placed on benchmarks of the continental grid. In 20 minutes or so of cooperation, the distances of 6 such instruments could be measured with astonishing precision, and tied into the benchmarks already scattered over the continent. Presently, photographing planes would fly overhead, taking overlapping pictures from 30,000 feet. They would show the survey points, and the measurements between them would be exact. The photos could be used as stereo pairs to take off contour lines, and in a few days there would be a map, a veritable cartographer's dream for accuracy and detail. That was the intention. But though Lockley hadn't heard of it yet, something was reported to have landed from space, and a shock like an impact was recorded, and all conditions would be shortly changed. It would be noted from the beginning, however, that an impact equal to 100-ton explosion was a very small shock for the landing of a bolide. It would add to the plausibility of reported deceleration, though, and would arouse acute suspicion. Justly so. At 8:20, Lockley called Sattel, who was southeast of him. The measuring instruments used microwaves and gave readings of distance by counting cycles and reading phase differences. As a matter of convenience, the microwaves could be modulated by a microphone, so the same instrument could be used for communication while measurements went on. But the microwaves were directed in a very tight beam. The device had to be aimed exactly right, and a suitable reception instrument had to be at the target if it was to be used at all. Also, there was no signal to call a man to listen. He had to be listening beforehand, and with his instrument aimed right, too. So Lockley flipped the modulator switch and turned on the instrument. He said, patiently, "Calling Sattel, calling Sattel, Lockley calling Sattel." He repeated it some dozens of times. He was about to give it up and call Vale instead when Sattel answered. He'd slept a little later than Lockley. It was now close to 9 o'clock, but Sattel had expected the call. They checked the functioning of their instruments against each other. "Right," said Lockley at last. "I'll check with Vale and go on out of the park, and then we'll put it all together and wrap it up and take it home." Sattel agreed. Lockley, rather absurdly, felt uncomfortable because he was going to have to talk to Vale. He had nothing against the man, but Vale was, in a way, his rival, although Jill didn't know of his folly and Vale could hardly guess it. He signed off to Sattel and swung the baseline instrument to make a similar check with Vale. It was now 10 minutes after 9. He aligned the instrument accurately, flipped the switch, and began to say, as patiently as before, "Calling Vale, Lockley calling Vale, over." He turned the control for reception. Vale's voice came instantly, scratchy and hoarse and frantic. "Lockley, listen to me. There's no time to tell me anything. I've got to tell you. Something came down out of the sky here nearly an hour ago. It landed in Boulder Lake, and at the last instant there was a terrific explosion and a monstrous wave swept up the shores of the lake. The thing that came down vanished under water. I saw it, Lockley." Lockley blinked. "What?" "A thing came down out of the sky," panted Vale. "It landed in the lake with a terrific explosion. It went under. Then it came up to the surface minutes later. It floated. It stuck things up and out of itself, pipes or wires. Then it moved around the lake and came into the shore. A thing like a hatch opened, and creatures got out of it. Not men." Lockley blinked again. "Look here—" "Damn it, listen!" said Vale shrilly. "I'm telling you what I've seen. Things out of the sky. Creatures that aren't men. They landed and set up something on the shore. I don't know what it is. Do you understand? The thing is down there in the lake now, floating. I can see it." Lockley swallowed. He couldn't believe this immediately. He knew nothing of radar reports or the seismograph record. He'd seen a barely balanced rock roll down the mountainside below him, and he'd heard a growling bass rumble behind the horizon, but things like that didn't add up to a conclusion like this. His first conviction was that Vale was out of his head. "Listen," said Lockley carefully. "There's a shortwave set over at the construction camp. They use it all the time for orders and reports and so on. You go there and report officially what you've seen. To the Park Service first, and then try to get a connection through to the Army." Vale's voice came through again, at once raging and despairing. "They won't believe me. They'll think I'm a crackpot. You get the news to somebody who'll investigate. I see the thing, Lockley. I can see it now. At this instant. And Jill's over at the construction camp." Lockley was unreasonably relieved. If Jill was at the camp, at least she wasn't alone with a man gone out of his mind. The reaction was normal. Lockley had seen nothing out of the ordinary, so Vale's report seemed insane. "Listen here," panted Vale again. The thing